Thank you everyone for coming here today to celebrate the inauguration of the HCI and Design Center. Before we start, I want to give another round of applause and thank you to our directors and staff and these wonderful speakers for being here today. And especially for starting off with civic engagement as our headline panel. I appreciate that deeply. So I thought as we're beginning the creation of this new center, it might be appropriate to reflect on the values of HCI in design and connect some of the work that Sheena and Brooke are doing on civics to how we think of HCI in general, which I think is a topic we all share an interest in. Now, I got interested in HCI and design in kind of a weird way. After college, I was working in a robotics lab, and my girlfriend at the time said, well, I don't know about you, but I'm going to join the Peace Corps. And so, of course, I joined the Peace Corps. We got placed in Outer Mongolia, where I worked as a teacher and a community development specialist. Mongolia is a stunningly beautiful country. Where we were was on the eastern province, so it's steppe as far as you can see. It's also a severely harsh climate. So in the winters, it gets down to about negative 40 degrees. It's so cold that when you would walk to work, when I'd walk 10 minutes to the school, by the time the moisture gets to your eyelids, it's turned to ice and your eyes stick together. It's just insane. Now some people say, well, negative 40, is that Celsius or Fahrenheit? I mean, does it matter, really? And it really doesn't, because it crosses over when it's that low. So one day when I'm walking to school, I would see this neighborhood kid I know, he'd pop out of the steam tunnels. And one day I was just thinking oh God, get to school. I was a teacher, so why are you messing around, get to school? And then one time I was just hit by a massive wave of guilt because I realized the kid wasn't messing around. That was where he lived to survive the winter. Because when you don't have a house, that's where you go. And then that was followed by kind of a second realization that, my future plans of being a roboticist weren't going to do anything for this kid. So that was one lesson. The second lesson, which took a lot longer to learn, was the importance of civic education. So social problems like poverty are decided by policy, government, activists. Those are not things that you can solve through individual action. And while there's many reasons for those policies, I think one of the root causes that we need to care about, that we can do something about, is how do we live up to our responsibilities as engaged citizens. Okay, so in terms of what we're doing here today, it seemed to me that HCI and design were maybe some of the perfect tools for designing technologies to promote civic engagement. So technology, design, social science allows us to build things like learning environments, like what Sheena was talking about, that teach civic abilities, platforms for collective action, and even design patterns for community organizing. So just to give you one example, in our current project here, we're leading the design of Evanston's participatory budgeting process, which will allow community members to decide how to spend $3 million on issues of inequity, climate change, and economic development in Evanston. Just if you haven't heard of PB before, there's these 6 phases, but basically we have a number of community conversations with hundreds of people across the city where they essentially brainstorm ideas for what we can do to improve our city. Then we sign up budget delegates from those conversations that take several months to really do policy development, take the ideas and develop them into fundable proposals. And then at the end, we get to vote on which ones we want. And then that is what the city will implement in the next budget cycle. We're also developing learning environments that allow students to work over multiple years in a real organization to promote and learn the skills of leadership skills for collective action. Some of the research questions we're asking, like my grad students, Christine Liu there in the audience, are what community capacities need to be developed to make participatory budgeting happen? What kinds of intelligence systems might improve our outreach to the community? How might we design platforms that manage the policy development process? And what organizational structures allow people to participate in politics to create positive change? But what I want to talk about today is the longer I work on civic engagement, the more I start to wonder if HCI+D is really the best discipline for solving these problems, or at least HCI+D as we think of it now. So I think we've made 3 assumptions about how we ought to think about HCI and design that maybe or maybe not widely shared. The first is that HCI and design should aim to solve societal challenges. Now, when we say human-centered design, I believe that to mean that we seek to address human needs and presumably the most important needs. So the standard, this is kind of a Rawlsian standard, but I think it's better articulated by Gandhi. He says the test for what we should do is to recall the face of the poorest and weakest man with whom you have seen and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him. Now that's a very high standard, perhaps unattainable, and one that I find myself continuously falling short of. But I wonder what our field would look like if we held ourselves to that standard for evaluating our work. Now, a second assumption that follows from this is that technology has to include all craft, productive technique, and technical skill. Now, this is an idea of technology kind of similar to the Greeks' idea of techne, which you might find in a philosophy of science and technology class. But it's also the same view of technology that Herb Simon shared in the Sciences of the Artificial, that technology includes all things from policies to organizations to computers. The definition I really like, which is a little bit fancy, a technology is a combination of assemblages, so recursive technologies embedded in it, that harness a natural or behavioral phenomena, which he calls the hardware, through a series of operations, which he calls the software, to fulfill a human need. Now, these definitions of technology, I think, have some difficult implications if we follow them through. So, for example, in this participatory budgeting project, one of the questions we have is how do we motivate the entire community to turn out to these events, especially the ones that are not currently participating or are harder to reach. Now, we found that the best technologies are actually face-to-face conversations and storytelling, not the sort of digital marketing technologies which are often currently just studied and designed in HCI. In fact, some of the political scientists have started to argue that the internet-based forms of mobilization, which made short-term gains when they were originally developed, came at the expense of long-term organizing, and some of the, which have led to an overall decrease in civic engagement. And there's currently a resurgence of interest in these older face-to-face technologies of community organizing, which are slower and more effective. So if we're committed to addressing the most important human needs, then we have to accept that we should use the technology that's most appropriate. And that might even mean studying when not to use technologies. I think the alternative is to sort of become that Silicon Valley parody of making the world a better place. Now, we have, of course, our own cautionary tales outside of pop culture of, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, or searching for the keys in the spotlight when you know they're over there because it's easier to look in the light. So I think HCI design might look more powerful, impactful, creative, and interesting if we applied a more accurate conception of technology. A third assumption is that implementation is maybe as important or must be included in design. Now, I have to say the design process still feels pretty magical to me. You start with nothing, and you end up with a working technology. I've taught design processes for classes like designing learning environments, technology consulting in the community, designing games and intelligent tutoring. I'm definitely a fan of the design process. And you can even think of participatory budgeting as a kind of policy design process. However, as I started to teach it for civic engagement, I found it to have less usefulness, I think, because in civic engagement, the overall concerns are shifting from problems of making to problems of doing. The design portion of creating an organization is maybe trivial compared with actually implementing that design. Now, someone who puts it a little bit better than me is a civic engagement philosopher, Peter Levine. When he's talking about writings on justice, these imagine that their readers to be systems designers, but we are not that. We are participants in existing systems capable of influencing them, or as Eleanor Ostrom writes, the choice confronting us is whether to support or oppose each aspect of a regime that governs us, not which regime to select as if from a menu, nor can we design and implement new regimes from scratch. So if our goal in HCI is to produce useful theoretical models of technologies that meet human needs, and we need to implement these technologies to test these models, then that commits us to processes that don't look much like our current ways of designing. So as we wrap up here, I just want to say that the problems that we face of the climate crisis, poverty, racism, now authoritarianism again, are serious. And as we look forward to the inauguration of a new Center of HCI and Design, I would challenge us to look past our traditional assumptions about what counts as an interesting problem or technology, and that our research should be more ambitious and focused on achieving outcomes in the world that matter. I think we can do so by thinking in a more expansive way about what HCI and design are, in ways that allow us to better achieve outcomes of democracy, justice, and development. As researchers, we have more freedom than most to choose what problems to work on and how we work on them. So let's use that power for good. Thank you.